The 5th of February, 1947. A four-star admiral steps off a military transport in Valparaiso after leading the largest polar expedition in human history. He has just commanded 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 23 aircraft across Antarctic waters for 8 weeks. The Chilean newspaper El Mercurio sends a reporter. What the admiral says in that interview will be printed in Santiago the next morning, referenced briefly in scattered European papers, and almost completely ignored by the American press. The statement is short and specific. He warns that the United States must adopt protective measures against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He describes a new threat emerging from the polar regions. Within 3 weeks, he is debriefed in Washington for an extended period. He gives no further interviews about the expedition for months. The official mission report is filed with heavy redactions. Entire sections remain classified to this day. His name is Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. He is not a fringe figure. He is one of the most decorated explorers in American military history, and the expedition he just completed was not a research voyage. It was the largest military deployment to Antarctica ever attempted. The official name was Operation Highjump. The official purpose was training personnel in cold weather conditions and testing equipment in freezing environments. That explanation requires ignoring the composition of the force, the duration of the mission, and what happened when it ended early. The stated mission was simple: establish an Antarctic research base, train military personnel in polar survival, test cold weather equipment, conduct scientific observations, demonstrate American presence in the region. The operation, launched in August 1946, planned to last 6 to 8 months through the Antarctic winter. It was framed as a natural extension of American polar research, led by the nation's most experienced Antarctic explorer. Byrd had been to the continent 3 times before. Those earlier expeditions used crews of 50 to 100 men. They operated with modest ships and limited aircraft. They were genuine research missions focused on mapping coastlines and collecting scientific data. Operation Highjump was not structured like those missions. The scale reveals a different kind of operation. The force included 4,700 military personnel. 13 ships formed the task group, including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, the submarine USS Senate, and multiple destroyers and support vessels. The air component consisted of 23 aircraft, including Martin PBM Mariner flying boats designed for reconnaissance, Douglas R-4D transports, 6 helicopters, and fighter aircraft. The budget reached $10 million in 1947 currency, equivalent to roughly $140 million today. This was not a research expedition. This was an invasion-scale deployment to a frozen continent with no military adversary and no strategic threat under the official narrative. Compare the scale to the stated purpose. Testing equipment in harsh conditions requires maybe 200 personnel and a handful of ships. Training soldiers in polar survival does not require an aircraft carrier. Establishing a single research base does not require a submarine. Scientific observation does not require fighter aircraft. The numbers do not align with the explanation. What kind of training mission deploys 4,700 men to Antarctica? What kind of equipment test requires an aircraft carrier positioned off the ice shelf? The official duration was 6 to 8 months. The operation was designed to continue through the Antarctic winter, precisely the period when conditions are harshest and equipment testing would be most valuable. But Highjump terminated after 8 weeks. The expedition was recalled in late February 1947, during the Antarctic summer when conditions were optimal. The official reason given was early onset of winter weather. That explanation contradicts the mission's stated purpose. If you are testing equipment in freezing temperatures and training personnel for harsh conditions, early winter is not a reason to abort. It is the entire point. 3 aircraft were lost during the mission. At least 1 death was confirmed. The recall was immediate. Byrd returned to the United States and entered an extended debriefing period that kept him away from public statements for months. This is where the story begins to separate from its official version. What Byrd said in Chile did not appear in American military publications. The New York Times ran no coverage of the warning statement. The Washington Post mentioned the expedition briefly, framing it as an exploration achievement with no reference to threats or strategic concerns. Life magazine published photographs of ice and equipment. The quote about enemy aircraft flying pole to pole at incredible speeds was printed in South America and mentioned in scattered European outlets. It was not printed in America. That is not an accident of editorial interest. That is a pattern of suppression around a statement made by a decorated officer immediately after a massive classified operation. What was Highjump actually doing in Antarctic waters for those 8 weeks? The expedition included a Central Group Air Operations Unit, equipped specifically for reconnaissance and mapping. The aircraft deployed were not general-purpose transports. They were photo-reconnaissance planes designed to survey large areas quickly. The Martin PBM Mariners could cover hundreds of miles of coastline per flight. The operation produced 70,000 aerial photographs. That number is not incidental documentation. That is systematic mapping at an unprecedented scale. The coverage area included vast stretches of previously unmapped Antarctic coastline, ice shelves, and inland regions. This was not training. This was a search and survey operation using the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft available in 1947. Now widen the context. What else was happening in 1946 and 1947 that might explain why the United States would send an aircraft carrier to Antarctica under cover of a training mission? The Second World War had ended 16 months earlier. Germany had surrendered in May 1945, but German activity in Antarctica had not been trivial. Between 1938 and 1939, Nazi Germany conducted its own Antarctic expedition, claiming a section of the continent they named New Swabia. They dropped swastika markers across hundreds of miles of territory. They conducted aerial surveys. They established the claim as part of a broader strategy to secure future resource access and strategic positioning. That mission ended when the war began, but it left an unresolved question about what Germany had found and whether any infrastructure remained. More troubling for post-war intelligence agencies, at least 10 German U-boats were never accounted for after the surrender. Rumors of continued submarine activity in the South Atlantic persisted into 1946. The Antarctic coastline offers thousands of miles of unexplored ice shelves, deep fjords, and natural harbors that could theoretically shelter small installations. These were not baseless rumors. They were operational concerns for Allied naval intelligence, trying to account for missing assets and personnel. At the same time, Operation Paperclip was in full swing, with American intelligence racing to capture German scientists, rocket engineers, and advanced technology before the Soviets could claim them. The post-war period was defined by this scramble for German knowledge and strategic advantage. Was Operation Highjump looking for something specific? The composition of the force suggests a mission designed to find things, not merely to test endurance. Photo reconnaissance at that scale is not training. It is intelligence gathering. The immediate recall after 8 weeks suggests the mission either found what it was looking for or encountered something that made continuation impossible under the operational parameters. Byrd's warning about threats emerging from polar regions, delivered immediately upon return, does not sound like the conclusion of a training exercise. It sounds like a strategic assessment based on new information. But there is another interpretation that becomes harder to dismiss when you look at what Antarctica actually contains. The continent holds an estimated 200 billion barrels of oil. It contains massive coal deposits, iron ore, copper, and uranium. It holds 70% of Earth's freshwater reserves locked in ice. In 1947, with the Cold War beginning and resource security becoming inseparable from national security, those numbers represented strategic value on a scale few other territories could match. The Soviet Union was expanding, resource competition was intensifying. Antarctica was the last unclaimed major landmass on Earth, and the nation that understood its resource structure first would have an enormous advantage in any future territorial negotiation. Byrd's warning, seen through this lens, stops being about mysterious threats and starts being about strategic vulnerability. What if he saw evidence of resource wealth that would inevitably drive great power competition? What if the reconnaissance data revealed that Antarctica was not just a frozen wasteland, but a continent with exploitable resources that would make it contested territory within decades? What if his warning about threats from polar regions was not about enemy aircraft, but about the future conflict that resource competition would generate? The timeline that follows supports this interpretation. In 1947, Byrd issues his warning, and the expedition ends abruptly. Between 1948 and 1955, multiple nations established permanent Antarctic bases in a sudden rush of territorial positioning. The United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and Chile all plant flags and build stations. In 1956 and 1957, 12 nations participate in the International Geophysical Year, which places 55 bases across the continent under the banner of scientific cooperation. And in 1959, those same 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, the most restrictive international agreement ever imposed on any landmass on Earth. The treaty bans military bases. It prohibits resource extraction. It freezes all territorial claims without recognizing or dismissing them. It requires that all activities be open to international inspection. It mandates unanimous consensus for any changes to the agreement. What the treaty actually does is lock Antarctica in permanent limbo, preventing the resource war that Byrd's 1947 warning predicted. But here is the question that connects his suppressed statement to the diplomatic lockdown that followed 12 years later. What did the major powers discover between 1947 and 1959 that made them all agree to freeze territorial competition on a continent worth trillions? Between 1947 and 1959 lies a 12-year gap that official histories treat as incremental scientific progress and international cooperation. The standard narrative describes a gradual shift from post-war territorial posturing to enlightened multilateral agreement. That version requires ignoring what actually intensified during those years. 6 nations raced to establish permanent bases on the most inhospitable continent on Earth. Chile and Argentina nearly came to armed conflict over overlapping territorial claims in 1952 and 1953. The Soviet Union built an inland research station at the Pole of Inaccessibility, the single most remote location on the continent, thousands of miles from any coastline or practical research target. Nations were not cooperating. They were claiming territory with military-scale urgency. The question is, why? In 1955, Richard Byrd returned to Antarctica. He was 68 years old. The operation was called Deep Freeze, and it was even larger than Highjump. Its stated purpose was to establish permanent American presence on the continent and prepare for the upcoming International Geophysical Year. Byrd's role was symbolic leadership. Real operational control remained with the Navy. He gave measured public statements. He spoke about scientific cooperation and polar research. He made no mention of threats, no warnings about enemy aircraft, no strategic concerns. The contrast with 1947 is complete. What changed between those two expeditions was not the strategic reality of Antarctica. What changed was that Byrd now stayed on message. His final Antarctic mission ended in 1956. He died in March 1957, just months before the International Geophysical Year began, and 2 years before the treaty negotiations that would lock the continent under international control. The International Geophysical Year ran from July 1957 to December 1958. It was presented as pure scientific collaboration, a Cold War thaw expressed through shared polar research. 12 nations participated. 55 bases were established across Antarctica. The stated goal was advancing human knowledge of Earth's polar regions through coordinated observation and data collection. That explanation is not false. It is incomplete. What the IGY actually accomplished was comprehensive mapping of Antarctica's subglacial structure using seismic surveys, ice-penetrating radar, and geological analysis. What was mapped was not just ice thickness. It was subglacial topography, geothermal activity, mineral deposits, and resource locations. The data was officially shared among participating nations, but full results were classified by individual governments. The IGY was not merely scientific cooperation. It was a neutral framework for ownership mapping before the diplomatic lockdown. Key findings emerged during this period that were not widely publicized until decades later. Soviet seismic data revealed ice-free lakes beneath the ice sheet, areas of significant geothermal activity, and continental resource structures far more extensive than earlier estimates suggested. The surveys showed that beneath the ice, Antarctica was not a barren, frozen desert, but a geologically active continent with accessible resources under the right extraction technology. The problem in 1958 was that the technology to extract resources from beneath a mile of ice did not exist at commercial scale, but the surveys made clear it would exist eventually. The IGY gave the major powers a complete picture of what Antarctica contained. What followed immediately was the treaty. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in Washington on the 1st of December, 1959. 12 nations were original signatories, exactly the 12 nations that participated in the International Geophysical Year. The treaty structure is worth examining closely because its function is not what the surface language suggests. Article 1 designates Antarctica for peaceful purposes only and bans military bases, weapons testing, and nuclear explosions. Article 4 is the critical provision. It freezes all territorial claims in their 1959 state. Claims are neither recognized nor dismissed. Nations with existing claims keep them locked in place. Nations without claims cannot make new ones. Article 7 requires all stations and installations to be open to inspection by other treaty parties. Article 9 mandates that any modification to the treaty requires unanimous consensus among consultative parties. What this architecture actually creates is permanent limbo. The treaty does not resolve territorial disputes. It suspends them indefinitely. It prevents resource extraction entirely, not just military use. It gives the 12 original signatories permanent veto power over any future changes through the consultative party mechanism. Later, signatories can join the treaty, but gain only observer status with no decision authority. The 1959 power structure is locked in place. No nation can be expelled. No provision can be modified without unanimous agreement. The treaty is presented as environmental protection and scientific cooperation. Its structural function is to prevent a resource war while extraction technology was still decades away from viability. Consider who benefited from this arrangement. In 1959, the technology to extract oil, minerals, or other resources from beneath Antarctic ice did not exist at any economically viable scale. The continent was strategically valuable but practically inaccessible for exploitation. The treaty locked territorial claims before technology advanced far enough to make extraction feasible. It prevented competition during the precise window when competition would have been most dangerous, before anyone could actually exploit the resources anyway. The original 12 signatories became permanent gatekeepers. They held veto power over future modifications. They secured their territorial claims in frozen legal status. Later arrivals gained access to scientific cooperation but no decision power over resource policy or territorial recognition. The surface narrative describes the treaty as enlightened multilateralism, a triumph of cooperation over conflict. That story survives because it is useful. It allows nations to claim environmental stewardship while protecting future resource access. It prevents expensive and dangerous territorial conflicts while technology remains inadequate. It creates a legal framework that appears to eliminate competition while actually preserving the 1959 power balance indefinitely. But the treaty's existence requires explanation. 12 nations with competing territorial claims and opposing Cold War allegiances do not suddenly agree to the most restrictive international resource ban in history without substantial pressure. What created that pressure was not idealism. It was the recognition that resource competition over Antarctica would become inevitable and uncontrollable once extraction technology matured. Return now to Byrd's 1947 warning. The statement about enemy aircraft flying pole to pole at incredible speeds has been interpreted in countless speculative directions, but reread it with the full context visible. He warned about the necessity of protective actions against threats emerging from polar regions. He emphasized strategic vulnerability. He spoke in standard military framing about future dangers that required immediate defensive preparation. What he actually saw during Operation Highjump was not enemy aircraft. What he saw was evidence that Antarctica would become strategically critical. The 70,000 reconnaissance photographs documented a continent with exploitable resources and geographic positioning that would matter enormously in any future global conflict. His warning was not about mysterious threats. It was about the inevitability of great power competition over Antarctic territory and resources. What could not be printed in 1947 was a detailed public explanation that America needed Antarctica for national security because of its resource wealth and strategic location. The American public was not prepared for that argument. The geopolitical situation was too unstable. Revealing the full scope of Antarctic resource potential would have accelerated the very territorial race that the later treaty was designed to prevent. So the warning was printed once, in Chile, in a foreign newspaper that most Americans would never see. The detailed resource findings from Highjump were classified, the strategic implications were buried. Byrd was debriefed and controlled. The official story became a training mission that ended early due to weather. The operational records tell the rest through their absences. The Operation Highjump official report was partially declassified in the 1990s, more than 4 decades after the mission. Sections covering mission objectives, intelligence findings, and photographic analysis remain classified. Byrd's personal logs were donated to the Byrd Polar Research Center by his family, but portions are restricted from public access. The Chilean interview transcript was never officially translated or published in American military records. The 70,000 reconnaissance photographs are stored in archives, but comprehensive analysis of what they show has never been released. The pattern is fragmentation and restriction. What is missing from the public record is a complete account of what the first large-scale American reconnaissance of Antarctica actually found and why the mission terminated after 8 weeks instead of 8 months. By 2023, 56 nations are party to the Antarctic Treaty. Resource extraction remains banned. The ice sheet is thinning due to climate change, making resources increasingly accessible. Extraction technology now exists that could viably access subglacial deposits. The estimated value of Antarctic resources runs into the trillions of dollars. Recent proposals to modify the treaty have been blocked by original consultative parties using their veto power. The 1959 agreement holds, but the pressure on it grows as resources become economically viable and ice coverage decreases. The question is whether a treaty, designed to prevent competition during a period of technological impossibility, can survive the era when extraction becomes practical and profitable. Byrd's 1947 statement now reads differently. He warned about strategic threats from polar regions. He predicted that Antarctica would require protective measures and international management. He understood that pole-to-pole flight paths meant the continent was no longer isolated from global power competition. He saw resource wealth that would inevitably drive territorial conflict. What was buried was not an extraordinary claim about alien technology or secret enemy bases. What was buried was an accurate assessment that Antarctica would become the next major zone of great power territorial competition, and that preventing that competition would require international agreements more restrictive than any previously attempted. The treaty signed in 1959 was the response to exactly what Byrd predicted in 1947. It prevented the resource war by freezing all claims before technology made extraction viable. It created a diplomatic structure that appears to eliminate competition while actually locking the 1959 power balance in place permanently. The suppression of Byrd's warning was not about hiding fantasy. It was about controlling public understanding of strategic reality. What got printed abroad was a clear statement of Antarctic strategic vulnerability. What got printed in America was a story about exploration, achievements, and scientific progress. The difference matters because it reveals how official narratives are constructed to manage public perception, while actual policy responds to the buried strategic logic. What remains locked today is not just Antarctic ice. It is the full historical record of what the first major reconnaissance expedition found, why it ended early, what the photographs show, and why a 4-star admiral's warning about polar threats was printed once in Chile and never fully explained in the country he served. 76 years later, portions of the Operation Highjump report remain classified. The strategic assessment that drove the 1959 treaty remains partially obscured, and the resources beneath the ice remain legally frozen under an agreement that becomes harder to maintain as the ice itself melts and technology advances. The continent that Byrd warned about in 1947 is still there, still strategically critical, still locked under the most restrictive territorial agreement ever imposed on any landmass on Earth.